The wind that swept down from the Mogollon Rim did not care for the boundaries drawn on paper by men in Washington. It was a dry, indifferent breath that scoured the Arizona territory, carrying the scent of sagebrush, ancient dust, and the copper tang of a storm brewing somewhere over the Dragoon Mountains. It was the year 1880, or perhaps 1881, out here, where the sun bleached the memory out of everything. The calendar mattered less than the height of the sun or the depth of the water in the cistern. Mara Kincaid paused in her scrubbing, her hands red and raw from the harsh lye soap. At 22 years of age, she felt as worn as the rough-hewn planks of the floor she knelt upon. The swing station, a glorified shack serving the stagecoach line that cut through the emptiness between Tucson and Lordsburg, was a place where hope usually stopped only long enough to change horses and drink bad coffee. She pushed a stray lock of hair, the color of dried wheat, back behind her ear. Her back ached with a dull, familiar throb. Mara was not a beauty in the way the silk-clad women in the illustrated papers were. She was sturdy, built for endurance, with eyes that held the quiet, watchful quality of a doe that knows the wolves are always circling. She was the daughter of a saddle-maker, a man who had taught her the smell of good leather and the value of a stitch that holds fast. But he was gone now, buried under a pile of stones 3 days' ride to the west, and she was here, nameless to most, simply Girl or Missy to the dusty travelers who threw copper coins on the table for her stew. More coffee, Girl, and make it hot this time! The voice boomed from the front room, rough with tobacco and impatience. It belonged to the station master, a man named Prickly and wide as a barrel. Mara wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric stiff with grease and starch. "Coming, Mr. Silas?" she murmured, though he could not hear her. She moved to the cast-iron stove, the black heart of the station. It was the only thing she felt an affinity for in this God-forsaken place. Fire was dangerous, but it was honest. If you fed it, it gave you warmth. If you respected it, it cooked your food. It did not lie, and it did not make promises it intended to break, unlike the men who passed through. As she lifted the heavy pot, her fingers brushed against the pocket of her skirt. There was a lump there, a small reassuring weight. It was a pouch made of oilcloth, cracked with age. Inside were the only inheritances she claimed, a few scrawled recipes from a mother she barely remembered, a dried sprig of lavender that had lost its scent years ago, and a small, rusted key to a box she no longer possessed. Tucked into her belt, hidden by the folds of her apron, was a kitchen knife. It was dull, the steel pitted, but the handle was shaped to her grip. It was her property, her protection, her final asset. She walked into the dining room. The air was thick with the smoke of cheap cigars and the smell of unwashed bodies. 3 men sat at the table. 2 were drivers, their faces like tanned leather, their eyes ringed with exhaustion. The 3rd man was different. He wore a badge that caught the flicker of the oil lamp. Deputy Holt Rudd. Holt was a handsome man in a way that made a dog's hackles rise. His smile showed too many teeth, and his eyes were flat, like river stones that had never seen the sun. "They say the payroll wagon is a day behind," one of the drivers said, blowing on his saucer of coffee. $50,000 in silver and greenbacks. That is enough to make a saint sin. Holt leaned back, his chair creaking. He picked his teeth with a splinter of wood. "It is not the silver that worries the army," he said, his voice smooth, like oil pouring over gravel. "It is the ledger." Mara poured the coffee, keeping her eyes down. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a shield. But she listened. Her father had taught her that, too. Listen to the leather, Mara. It groans before it breaks. "The ledger?" the driver asked. "The book," Holt explained, watching Mara's hand as she poured. She steadied the pot, refusing to tremble. "The Army keeps records of every contractor, every supply shipment, every payment made to keep the peace with the tribes. If that book were to vanish, or fall into the wrong hands, well, a lot of powerful men would sleep uneasy. Or if someone wanted to prove the Indians were raiding the supply lines, the other driver muttered. Give the army a reason to wipe them out for good. Holt chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. The Apache does not need a reason to kill. They are wolves. You do not reason with a wolf. You put it down. Mara retreated to the kitchen, her heart beating a little faster. She did not know politics. She did not know the grand strategies of the generals or the corruptions of the contractors. She only knew that talk of money and killing usually ended with someone kicking open the kitchen door. 5 miles to the south, the moon was rising over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the jagged peaks in shades of silver and indigo. The air here was thinner, colder. Taza crouched on a ridge of sandstone, his body blending so perfectly with the rock that he seemed carved from it. He was Chiricahua, a man of the mountain people. He wore a shirt of calico, stained with dust and sweat, and buckskin leggings that had seen 100 trails. A strip of red cloth held back hair as black as a raven's wing. He was not an old man, perhaps 30 winters, but his face carried the lines of one who has seen the end of his world. His eyes were dark, observant, and sharp as obsidian glass. He did not look with anger, but with a profound, simmering clarity. Below him, in the shadow of the canyon wall, lay a cabin. It was an old structure, abandoned years ago by a prospector who had found only death instead of gold. The roof sagged, and the door hung on one hinge, gaping like a dead man's mouth. It was a cold home. That was what his people would say. A place where the fire had died, where no stories were told, where the spirits of the ancestors did not visit. Taza descended the slope, moving with a silence that was not practiced, but innate. A loose stone did not clatter under his moccasin. A twig did not snap. He was a ghost in a land that was trying to exorcise him. He reached the cabin and stepped inside. The smell of rat droppings and old, cold soot greeted him. He did not wrinkle his nose. It was shelter. The wind was picking up, carrying the heavy, metallic scent of hail. A storm was coming from the north. He placed his rifle, a Winchester he had taken from a soldier who no longer needed it, against the wall. He did not light a fire. To light a fire was to say, "I am here," and Taza was not ready to be found. He was a man apart. His band had been moved to the reservation at San Carlos, a place of dust and stagnant water. But he had slipped away. He could not breathe the air of a cage. He sat on the dirt floor, his back against the rough logs. He pulled a piece of dried meat from his pouch and chewed it slowly. He thought of the deputy he had seen riding toward the stage station earlier that day. He thought of the fresh telegraph wires that cut across the sky, humming with the white man's talking lightning. They were sewing the land shut, closing it off, fencing the open range with words and wire. He felt a phantom pain in his shoulder, where a bullet had grazed him 2 winters ago. It was a reminder. Trust was a weakness. Mercy was a mistake. Yet, as the wind howled through the gaps in the logs, he felt a strange hollowness in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. It was the solitude. A wolf is strong alone, but a wolf belongs to a pack. He had no pack. He had only the mission he had set for himself to watch, to witness, and perhaps, if the spirits allowed, to strike back at the liars who stole the water and the land. Back at the station, the night had fully descended. The drivers had retired to the bunkhouse, snoring loud enough to rattle the window panes. Deputy Holt had taken the best room, the one usually reserved for officers or wealthy cattlemen. Mara sat on a stool in the kitchen, the embers of the stove casting a dull red glow on her face. She pulled the knife from her belt and picked up a smooth river stone she kept on the shelf. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The rhythmic sound of steel on stone was soothing. It was a sound of preparation. Her father had taught her to sharpen tools. A dull blade is dangerous. Mara, it slips, it tears. A sharp blade goes where you tell it to. She looked at the knife. It was a humble thing. A tool for chopping onions, for slicing bacon. But in her hand, it felt like the only truth she owned. She thought of the ledger the men had spoken of. A book of names, a book of sins. She wondered why men killed for paper. She had seen men kill for water, for a horse, for a woman, but paper, it seemed a madness. The wind rattled the kitchen door, shaking the latch. Mara shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, to pack her oilcloth bag and walk out into the dark, away from the smell of grease and stale tobacco, away from the eyes of Deputy Holt. But where would she go? The desert was a vast, indifferent ocean. Without a horse, without a guide, she would be dead in 2 days. Coward, she whispered to herself. The word hung in the air, accusing. She was not a coward. She was a survivor, but survival had a taste, and it tasted like ash. She stood up and moved to the window, peering out into the blackness. The telegraph poles looked like gaunt crosses against the starless sky. Somewhere out there, the wires were singing. Somewhere out there, the payroll wagon was rolling its wheels through the dust, carrying silver and secrets. And somewhere out there, though she did not know it, a man sat in a cold cabin, listening to the same wind, sharpening his own kind of blade, not of steel, but of resolve. The storm broke an hour past midnight. It did not rain. It hammered. Hailstones the size of musket balls slammed into the roof of the station, sounding like 100 hammers striking at once. The horses in the corral whinnied in panic. Mara lay on her pallet in the corner of the pantry, unable to sleep. The noise was deafening. It felt as if the sky itself was falling, shattering into millions of pieces of ice. She heard a door open in the main building, heavy boots on the floorboards, voices raised, but not in casual conversation. These were tight, urgent whispers. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. It was too late for a stagecoach. It was too early for the morning crew. She crept to the door of the pantry and pressed her ear against the wood. "Tonight, while the hail covers the noise," a voice said. It sounded like Holt. "The girl," another voice asked, a stranger's voice. "She is nobody. She sees nothing, and if she does—" Holt paused, and the silence was more terrifying than any threat. "We blame the Apache. It is always the Apache." Mara's breath hitched in her throat. Her hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt. They were not talking about the payroll wagon coming tomorrow. They were talking about something happening now. She heard the front door unlatch. The wind howled into the room, bringing the sound of the hail closer, louder. Then the door slammed shut. Mara waited for a heartbeat. 2, 3. Then she pushed the pantry door open. The kitchen was empty. The main room was empty. She moved to the window that looked out toward the corral. Through the sheets of falling ice, she saw lanterns swinging in the darkness, not near the horses, but near the office where the safe was kept. She knew she should go back to her pallet. She should pull the blanket over her head and pretend she was deaf and blind. That was the rule of survival. Do not look at what does not concern you. But the oilcloth bag in her pocket felt heavy against her hip. Her mother had been a woman who healed. Her father had been a man who built. Neither of them had been people who hid. Mara grabbed a heavy woolen coat from the hook by the door. It belonged to the station master, but she did not care. She threw it over her shoulders and unlatched the back door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The hail stung her face, sharp and biting. She gasped, blinking against the onslaught, and stepped out into the chaotic night. She did not run toward the lanterns. She ran toward the shadows, toward the edge of the yard, where the sagebrush began. She needed to see, she needed to know, and miles away, in the cold cabin, Taza lifted his head. He could not hear the voices at the station, nor could he see the girl stumbling through the ice, but he felt the shift in the air. The storm was not just weather. It was a curtain rising. He reached for his Winchester. He did not know why, but he knew that the time for sitting was over. The wind had changed direction. It was blowing toward the station, and it smelled of gunpowder and blood. The prologue was over. The story was about to bleed. Mara crouched behind a water trough, the ice pelting her back. She watched as 3 shapes moved toward the telegraph office. One was Holt. She recognized the set of his shoulders. The others were shadowed. bulky men in long dusters. They did not pick the lock. They did not pry the door. One of them produced a key, a master key, likely stolen or bought with blood money. They slipped inside. Mara realized then that the rumor of the payroll wagon was a distraction. The real treasure, the dangerous treasure, was already here, or the information leading to it was here. The ledger. They were not stealing the money. They were stealing the truth. A cry rang out short, sharp, and abruptly cut off. It came from the bunkhouse, not the office. Mara's blood ran cold. They were killing the witnesses, the drivers, the station master. She was next. She looked at the dull knife in her hand. It seemed pitifully small against the revolvers and rifles of the men inside. She looked at the vast, dark emptiness of the desert stretching out behind her. To run was to die of exposure. To stay was to die of lead. She made her choice. She gripped the knife until her knuckles were white. She would not die in a corner like a trapped rat. She would run, but she would run with a purpose. She turned and sprinted into the storm, her boots crunching on the hail, her breath tearing at her lungs. She ran toward the canyons, toward the only place where the white men hesitated to go. She ran toward the land of the Apache, and as she ran, she whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening, asking not for salvation, but for time, just enough time to find a place to stand. The wind swallowed her figure, erasing her footprints as fast as she made them. The exposition was finished. The inciting incident had begun to unfold in the dark, and the ledger of fate had just opened its first page. The hail had turned the ground into a slush of ice and mud, a treacherous surface that sucked at Mara's boots with every desperate step. The darkness was absolute, save for the erratic flashes of lightning that illuminated the sagebrush in ghostly, skeletal bursts. Behind her, the station was a hive of shouting men and the terrifying pop of gunfire, sounds that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the vast indifference of the desert wind. She scrambled over a low ridge, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs like raw whiskey. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to put the ridge between herself and the men who had ridden in under the cover of the storm. A hand shot out from the shadow of a mesquite bush, grabbing her ankle. Mara stifled a scream, kicking out instinctively with her free boot. She connected with something soft, and a groan rose from the mud. She fell hard, her shoulders slamming into the wet earth, the air driven from her chest. She rolled onto her back, the kitchen knife raised in a trembling hand, ready to strike. "Mara, stop!" The voice was wet and weak. Lightning flashed again, and she saw him. It was Elias, the young telegraph operator who had arrived only 2 days ago. He was lying on his side, his legs twisted at an unnatural angle, his shirt dark and slick with blood that looked black in the dim light. "Elias," she whispered, crawling toward him, the mud soaking through the knees of her dress. "Can you move? We have to move. Done for," he wheezes, a bubble of pink froth forming on his lips. "Gut shot. Holt. It was Holt." Mara froze. The name hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "The deputy. Not a deputy?" Elias gasped, his hand fumbling at his belt. "A thief. Him and the contractor. They cooked the books, supply lines, ghost shipments." His fingers, slick with his own blood, pressed something cold and hard into Mara's palm. "Take it." She looked down. It was a small brass key, tarnished and heavy. Along with it was a crumpled piece of paper, the ink running slightly from the wet, but the indented dots and dashes of the Morse code still visible, punched through by a heavy stylus. "The ledger," Elias rasped, his eyes losing focus. "It is not in the safe. They will blow the safe, but it is not there. This key brings the ledger. Don't let them have it. Mara, if they get it, they erase the theft. They blame the Apache for the missing supplies. They will start a war just to cover their balance sheet." "I don't understand," Mara said, panic rising in her throat. "I am just a cook. Elias, what do I do?" "Run," he said, the word barely a breath. "Hide. The code. Tells where." His head lolled back against the mud. The light went out of his eyes, leaving them staring up at the storm-tossed sky. Mara scrambled backward, the key cutting into her palm. She heard heavy boots crunching on the hail nearby. "Check the wash," a voice bellowed. It was Holt. His voice was not the smooth oil she had heard in the station. It was jagged with adrenaline and violence. The operator made a run for it. "Find him, and find the girl. She saw us." Mara pressed herself flat against the earth, behind the thin screen of the mesquite. She was not 10 yards from where Elias lay. She saw the silhouette of Holt Rudd step onto the ridge. He held a lantern in one hand and a heavy Colt revolver in the other. He swept the light over the ground. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on Elias's body. Holt grunted. He walked over, nudging the dead boy with the toe of his boot. He knelt, patting down Elias's pockets with frantic, rough motions. "Empty," Holt spat. Standing up, he turned to the other men who were emerging from the gloom. "The key is gone. The boy passed it off." "To who?" one of the men asked. Holt looked out into the darkness, his eyes seeming to bore straight through the brush where Mara lay shivering. "The girl, the kitchen girl. I saw her slip out the back." He raised his voice, pitching it loud enough to carry over the wind, loud enough for his men to hear, and loud enough to seal Mara's fate. "She is in on it," Holt shouted. "Kincaid's girl. She signaled the raiders. She is running to join her Apache bucks with the payroll key. I want her found $500 for her head, dead or alive." The lie was so sudden, so complete, that Mara felt the breath leave her again. In 10 seconds, he had turned her from a witness into a villain. He had stripped her of her humanity and painted a target on her back. She was no longer Mara the cook. She was a traitor, an accomplice to the very savages the territory feared most. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. But beneath the fear, a small, hard ember of anger ignited. It was the same anger she felt when the stage driver slapped her bottom, the same anger she felt when she was told to speak only when spoken to. She gripped the key and the paper tight. She slid backward, inch by inch, until she dropped into the dry wash below the ridge. Then she turned and ran. She ran until the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruise purple and blood orange. The storm had passed, leaving the air scoured and thin. The cold of the night evaporated instantly, replaced by a rising, shimmering heat that promised a brutal day. Mara had left the flatlands behind. She had climbed blindly, her instincts driving her toward the only cover available, the jagged, unforgiving terrain of the canyonlands. Here, the earth was broken, twisted into spires of red rock and deep, shadowed crevices. She was exhausted. Her legs felt like lead weights, and her throat was coated with dust. She had lost one of her hairpins, and her hair hung in a tangled mess around her face. Her dress, once a simple calico meant for kitchen work, was torn at the hem and stained with mud and the grease of the station. She crested a rise and looked down into a narrow ravine. It was a dead end. Panic fluttered in her chest. She turned to double back, but her boot landed on a patch of loose shale. The ground gave way. Mara fell. She slid down the steep slope, shale and sharp rocks tearing at her skirts. She scrambled for a handhold, grabbing at a protruding root, but it snapped. She tumbled the last 10 feet, her right leg slamming hard against a jagged edge of sandstone before she hit the bottom of the ravine with a bone-jarring thud. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her leg. Mara cried out, the sound echoing off the canyon walls, mocking her. She lay there for a moment, waiting for the world to stop spinning. When she pushed herself up, she looked at her leg. The fabric of her skirt was ripped, and beneath it, a gash ran from her shin to her ankle. It was deep, oozing bright red blood that mixed with the dust. She bit her lip to keep from sobbing. She tore a strip from her petticoat, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries, and bound the wound tight. The pressure made her dizzy, but she tied the knot. "Get up," she commanded herself. Her voice was a croak. "Get up, Mara." She tried to stand, but her leg buckled. She collapsed again, gasping. The sun climbed higher. It was a hammer now, beating down on the red rocks, baking the air in the ravine. There was no shade here, no water, only the heat and the silence. Thirst began to claw at her throat. She patted her pockets. The oilcloth bag was still there, the key, the paper, the dull knife, but no water. In her haste to escape the station, she had grabbed a coat, but she had forgotten a canteen. Hours passed. The shadows shifted. Mara dragged herself toward the sliver of shade offered by an overhang, but it was shrinking by the minute. Her tongue felt swollen, too large for her mouth. She began to hear things, the sound of hoofbeats that weren't there, the sound of her father's hammer on leather. They are coming, she thought. Holt and his men, Silas the tracker. They will find me, and they will hang me, and no one will ever know the truth. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the hot stone. She was going to die here, not as a hero, not as a witness, but as a dried-out husk in a nameless canyon. A pebble skittered down the canyon wall. Mara's eyes snapped open. She grabbed the handle of her knife, pulling it from her belt. She pushed herself up against the rock, wincing as her legs screamed in protest. "Stay back," she croaked, waving the knife. "I will cut you." There was no movement, only the shimmering heat haze. Then she saw him. He was standing on a ledge 20 feet above her, silhouetted against the blinding white of the sky. He was not wearing a duster or a cowboy hat. He wore a headband of red cloth and a shirt of faded calico. An Apache. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The stories of the territory flooded her mind. Stories of torture, of mutilation, of women dragged off and never seen again. Holt had accused her of running to them, and now, here was one, summoned like a demon by the lie. He stood perfectly still. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, the barrel pointing at the ground. He was looking down at her, his face unreadable in the shadow of the ledge. He did not look angry. He did not look bloodthirsty. He looked patient, like a hawk watching a mouse that has already broken its back. Mara gripped the knife tighter, though her hand felt weak. "Go away," she whispered, though she knew he could likely not understand her. And even if he did, why would he obey? The Apache moved. He did not raise the rifle. He reached to his side and unhooked a gourd canteen from his belt. He tossed it. The canteen sailed through the air and landed in the dust, rolling to a stop 3 feet from Mara. She stared at it. She looked back up at him. He had resumed his stillness, watching. Was it a trick? A cruel game thirst overrode fear. Mara lunged for the canteen. She uncorked it with trembling fingers and lifted it to her lips. Water. Warm. Tasting of the gourd, but water. It flooded her mouth, shocking her parched throat. She drank greedily, choking slightly, water spilling down her chin and washing away the dust. She lowered the canteen, clutching it to her chest. She looked up at him again. "Why?" she asked. He did not answer. He turned and moved along the ledge with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a man of his size. He found a path down the rock face, a path she had not seen, and descended. He dropped the last few feet into the ravine, landing soundlessly. Up close, he was terrifying. He was tall, lean muscle, smelling of wood smoke and sage. His eyes were dark, set deep in a face that looked like it had been carved from the canyon walls. A scar ran across his left cheekbone, fading into his hairline. He stopped 10 paces from her. He looked at her leg, wrapped in the bloody petticoat. Then he looked at her face. He walked toward her. Mara scrambled back, raising the knife again. "Don't touch me!" He stopped. He looked at the knife, the dull, pitted kitchen blade with a flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps pity. He did not raise his hands in surrender. He simply stood there, radiating a calm dominance that made her aggression feel childish. "The knife is dull," he said. His voice was low, rough like gravel grinding together. His English was accented, the vowels flat and hard, but clear. Mara blinked, stunned. "Stay back. You are bleeding," he stated. It was not a question. "You are loud. You smell of fear and lye soap. The bluecoats will smell you a mile away. The man with the long gun, the tracker, he will find you before the sun touches the rim." "Holt," she breathed. You saw them. I saw men who ride like they own the earth, the Apache said. I saw them hunting a rabbit. His eyes locked onto hers. You are the rabbit. Mara lowered the knife slightly. I am not a rabbit. I am... She faltered. Who was she? I am innocent. He made a small, dismissive sound in his throat. Innocence is a story for children. The desert does not care if you are innocent. It only cares if you can walk. He turned his back on her, looking up at the sky where vultures were beginning to circle, high up in the thermal currents. Wait, Mara said. She realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that if he left her, she was dead. He was her only chance. He knew the land. He had water. Wait, please. He half turned. I can't go back, she said, desperation making her voice shake. They will hang me. I have nowhere. She struggled to stand, putting weight on her bad leg, crying out through gritted teeth but forcing herself upright. She swayed, dizzy with pain. I have no money, she said, the words tumbling out. I have no horse. I have nothing. She held out her hands, the palms calloused and scarred from years of peeling potatoes and scrubbing floors. I have nothing but my hands, and I can cook. I can make a fire from wet wood. I can make soup from stones. I can work. It was a ridiculous offer. A cook, in the middle of the wasteland, offering domestic service to a warrior. Taza looked at her hands. He looked at the determination in her eyes, warring with the terror. He saw the tremble in her legs. He remembered the smell of the station, the greed of the men there. He knew what it was to be hunted for a crime you did not commit. He knew what it was to have land stolen, names blackened. He did not step forward to help her. He did not offer a hand to steady her. That was not the way. If she was to survive, she had to stand on her own feet. He looked past her, toward the north, where the clouds were gathering again over the peaks. I do not need a cook, he said. Mara's shoulders slumped. The hope drained out of her. But, he added, his voice dropping to a murmur that barely carried over the wind. A fire is good when the night is cold. He adjusted the strap of his rifle. He did not smile. He did not offer reassurance. He simply looked at her with those dark, knife-sharp eyes. Walk, Taza said. The wind is rising. He turned and began to walk up the ravine, moving toward the deep, hidden heart of the canyon. He did not look back to see if she was following. Mara stood there for a second, swaying. She looked at the blood on her leg. She looked at the retreating back of the Apache warrior. Then, she grit her teeth, shoved the dull knife back into her belt, and took a step, and then another. She limped after him, leaving a trail of dragged footprints in the dust, moving away from the world of laws and ledgers, and into the wild, silent unknown. The cabin was a carcass of timber and stone, huddled against the base of a limestone cliff that wept a slow, trickling spring. It had been abandoned for years, likely since the last great raids of the 70s. The door was missing, leaving a gap like a missing tooth, and the interior smelled of rat nests and the acrid, ancient dust of wood rot. Taza stopped 10 yards out, his rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm. He scanned the ridgeline, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the midday sun. He did not look at the cabin. To him, it was a trap. Walls were blindfolds. A roof was a lid on a coffin. It is shelter, Mara said, her voice rasping. She leaned heavily against a stunted juniper tree, her injured leg throbbing with a dull, sickening rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The bandage she had improvised was stiff with dried blood and brown dust. It is a dead place, Taza replied. Then we will wake it up. She pushed off the tree and limped toward the dark opening. Taza watched her go. He could have stopped her. He could have told her that they should sleep in the brush, under the stars, where the wind could carry the scent of an enemy, but he saw the set of her jaw. It was the same look a mare had when she was protecting a foal, or a wolf when it was cornered. She needed walls. She needed to pretend, for a few hours, that civilization still existed. He did not follow her inside immediately. He circled the perimeter, checking for tracks, for rattlesnakes, for the signs of the white men who hunted them. Inside, Mara collapsed onto the dirt floor. The room was small, dominated by a stone hearth that was choked with the gray ash of a fire that had burned out a decade ago. A rusted iron pot lay on its side, looking like a discarded helmet. She took a breath. The air was cold. Despite the heat outside, it was the chill of abandonment. "Get up, Mara," she whispered to herself. She dragged herself to the hearth. She found a bundle of stiff twigs near the entrance, a rat's midden, and shoved them into the grate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her flint and steel. Her hands shook, but she struck the spark. Once, twice. A tiny tongue of orange flame licked at the dry twigs. It was a small thing, that fire, but as the smoke curled up the chimney, drawing well despite the years, Mara felt something loosen in her chest. A fire meant a kitchen meant food. Food meant life. She began to clean. It was an absurdity, given her leg and their peril. But she could not stop. She found a broken branch and used it to sweep the rat droppings from the corner. She set the rusted pot upright. She was channeling her mother. And she was channeling Ellie, the head cook at the station who had taught her that a clean surface was the first step to a good meal. When Taza finally stepped through the doorway, the air in the cabin had changed. It no longer smelled only of death. It smelled of wood smoke and effort. He stood in the entrance, blocking the light. He looked at the fire, then at the swept floor, and finally at Mara, who was trying to scrub the inside of the rusted pot with a handful of sand. "Smoke tells the sky where we are," he said. "The wind is blowing down from the rim," Mara countered, not looking up. "It will disperse before it rises, and I need to boil water for the leg and for the soup. If we find anything to put in it." Taza watched her. He did not trust white people. He had seen them sign treaties with one hand and steal cattle with the other. He had seen them smile while they poisoned water holes. But this woman was different. She did not scream. She did not demand. She built a nest out of nothing. He walked past her, his movement silent. He placed a dead jackrabbit near the fire he had snared it miles back without her noticing. "Clean it," he said. "Do not waste the blood." He sat near the door, facing outward, his back to the wall. The silence between them stretched, taut as a bowstring. Mara feared the violence in him, the efficient way he killed, the silence that seemed to judge her very existence. Taza feared the noise of her, the clumsiness of her boots, the liability she represented. They were two species of prey hiding in the same burrow, waiting for the hawk. That night, while the rabbit stew bubbled in the scrubbed pot flavored with wild onions Taza had pulled from the earth and the last of the salt from Mara's pocket, Mara took out the paper Elias had given her. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the rough logs. Mara unfolded the crumpled sheet. The dots and dashes were punched deep into the paper. "What is that?" Taza asked. He was sharpening his knife, the rhythmic shh sound filling the room. "It is a voice," Mara said. "A voice that travels on the wire." "The talking lightning," Taza spat into the fire. "It brings only lies." "This one might be the truth," she said. "Elias, the boy who died, he gave it to me." She stared at the code. She had watched Elias work for hours, fascinated by the language of clicks. She knew the alphabet. She began to whisper the letters as she deciphered them. SHIPMENT, DELAYED, ROUTE, CHANGE. She paused, her finger tracing the next line. PAY, HOLT, TWO, THOUSAND. Mara sucked in a breath. $2,000, she whispered. "That is the price of a soul." She continued. COLONEL, GRAVES, SILENCE, APACHE, BLAME. She looked up at Taza. His knife had stopped moving. He was watching her, his eyes reflecting the flames. "It is a list," she said, her voice trembling. "It says Deputy Holt was paid $2,000. It says a Colonel Graves is involved. It says the supplies were never stolen by your people. They were never shipped at all. They kept the money and blamed the Apache for raiding the wagons that did not exist." Taza's expression did not change, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. "We starve," he said softly. "Our children cry for beef that was promised, and they eat gold in their stone houses. This paper," Mara held it up. "If people saw this, if the judge in Santa Fe saw this—" "Paper burns," Taza said. "Men like Holt do not fear paper. They fear bullets." "But this is proof," Mara insisted. "It is why they killed Elias. It is why they want me dead. They do not just want the money, they want to bury the lie." Taza stood up. He walked over and took the paper from her hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was careful. He looked at the markings he could not read, staring at the mystery of the white man's magic. "Proof," he murmured. He handed it back. "Keep it, but do not think it is a shield. It is a target." 2 days' ride to the east, in the smoky back room of a saloon in Lordsburg. Deputy Holt Rudd poured a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid swirled in the light. Opposite him sat a man who looked as if he had been cured in smoke. Silas Crow was lean, wearing a duster that had seen better decades and a hat pulled low over eyes that were a pale, watery blue. He did not touch his drink. $500, Holt said. "For the girl, and another $5 for the Apache she is with." Silas Crow smiled. It was a small movement that did not reach his eyes. "An Apache buck and a kitchen girl. A strange pairing. Romantic. Almost." "She is a traitor," Holt said, his voice tight. "She seduced the savage. She helped them raid the station. She has sensitive property." "The ledger," Silas said. He did not ask. He stated. He knew how men like Holt worked. There was always a ledger, or a letter, or a witness. "Just bring them in," Holt said. "Dead is preferred. Less paperwork." Silas stood up. He adjusted the heavy coat on his hip. "I do not care about your paperwork. Deputy, I care about the weight of the silver. You will have your bodies." He turned and walked out. He moved with a terrifying grace, his spurs jingling softly. He was a hound who had caught a scent, and he would run until his heart burst or the prey was dead. The journey across the high desert was a crucible. Mara's leg was healing, but the scar tissue pulled tight with every step. They moved mostly at night to avoid the heat and the eyes of the cavalry patrols that were sweeping the area. Taza led them through a labyrinth of canyons where the red rock walls squeezed the sky into a thin blue ribbon. He taught her without speaking. He would stop and point to a disturbed patch of gravel, a snake. He would pause and sniff the air water. One afternoon, as they crossed a high plateau exposed to the heavens, the sky turned a bruised purple. The temperature plummeted. "Run," Taza said. Mara did not question him. She hobbled as fast as she could, her breath tearing at her throat. The hail hit them like a volley of musket fire. These were not the small stones of the station attack. These were chunks of ice the size of fists. They slammed into the earth, exploding into shards. Taza grabbed Mara's arm and dragged her under a shelf of rock. It was a shallow overhang, barely deep enough for two. He shoved her against the back wall and crouched in front of her, using his own body as a shield against the ricocheting ice. Mara could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the sage and the sweat. For the first time, she was close enough to see the individual strands of his black hair, the fine web of lines around his eyes. The storm roared like a freight train. The world outside was a white blur of violence. "Are you cold?" he asked. He did not look at her. "Yes," she whispered. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering. He shifted, unrolling the wool blanket he carried across his chest. He draped it over both of them, under the heavy wool, in the small, dark space. The world narrowed down to just the two of them. Mara looked at the back of his neck. He was taking the brunt of the wind to keep her warm. He was a savage. The newspapers said, a monster. Yet here he was, a living wall between her and the storm. "Thank you," she said. He grunted. "The ice will pass. The mud will be deep." It was not a conversation. It was a fact, but in the darkness, Mara felt a shift. The fear she had held since the station, the fear of him began to dissolve, replaced by a strange, quiet anchor of trust. 3 days later, they reached a trading post near the border. It was a necessity. They were out of flour, out of coffee, and Mara's bandage needed changing. They waited until dusk. Taza stayed in the shadows of the porch, his hat pulled low, his rifle hidden under his serape. Mara went inside. The bell above the door jingled. The store was dim, smelling of dry goods and kerosene. A fat man with a stained apron stood behind the counter. 2 women were inspecting a bolt of fabric in the corner. They stopped. They turned. Mara walked to the counter. She felt the eyes on her. She had washed her face in a creek, but her dress was torn, and she looked wild, sun-bleached. "I need flour," she said, her voice sounding too loud in the silence. "And beans, and a tin of salve." The storekeep stared at her. His eyes flicked to the window, where Taza's silhouette was visible. "We do not serve your kind," the man said. Mara blinked. "My kind I have coin." She placed a silver dollar on the counter, one she had found in the station master's coat pocket. The man swiped the coin off the counter and threw it on the floor. It rolled across the planks, ringing hollowly. "Keep your blood money," he spat. "We heard about you, the Kincaid girl. Ran off with a redskin. Helped them butcher good white men." The women in the corner whispered. One of them pulled her child closer, as if Mara carried a plague. "That is a lie," Mara said, her hands trembling. "Deputy Holt lied. Get out." The man reached under the counter. "Before I get my scattergun." Mara stood there, frozen. The injustice of it burned her face like acid. She had cooked for these people's cousins. She had scrubbed floors. She was one of them. And now, with a few words from a man with a badge, she was a pariah. She was lower than the dust. The door opened. Taza stepped in. The room seemed to shrink. He did not draw a weapon. He simply walked to where the coin lay on the floor. He picked it up. He walked to the counter and placed the coin gently on the wood. Then he reached into his pouch and placed a second coin next to it. Double the price. He looked the storekeep in the eye. The fat man swallowed, his hand freezing halfway to his shotgun. Taza's gaze was not angry. It was heavy. It carried the weight of 1,000 years of silence. "Flour," Taza said. "Beans." The man trembled. He hurriedly bagged the goods, his face pale. He pushed them across the counter. Taza took the bag. He took Mara's elbow. "Come." They walked out into the twilight. Mara felt the tears stinging her eyes, hot and humiliated. She had never felt so alone, so severed from her own people. They camped that night in a dry wash, miles from the post. Mara cooked in silence. She made a stew with the beans and the fresh jerky. The smell was rich and comforting, a stark contrast to the coldness of the world. She filled a tin plate and handed it to Taza. He took it, nodding once. She sat opposite him, eating slowly. The rejection at the store still stung. "They look at me like I'm a monster," she said softly. Taza chewed, swallowed. "Now you see through my eyes?" he said. It was not said with malice. It was a simple observation. Mara looked at him. She saw the way he sat, always alert. She saw the loneliness that he wore like a second skin. She noticed, for the first time, a leather thong around his neck. Hanging from it was a single blue bead and a small, polished piece of turquoise. "What is that?" she asked, pointing with her spoon. Taza's hand went to the necklace. He covered the bead with his thumb. "It belonged to my sister," he said. His voice was lower than the wind. "She died at San Carlos, of the coughing sickness. The blankets the government gave us. They were cold, but they carried heat. Smallpox or tuberculosis. The gifts of the government." "I'm sorry," Mara said. It felt inadequate. "She liked the blue beads," Taza said, staring into the fire. "She said they were pieces of the sky that fell down so we would not forget the sun when the night came." He looked at Mara. "You have the same look in your eyes, the look of someone who is holding up the sky." He stood up and walked into the darkness. Mara thought he was leaving to patrol. A few minutes later, he returned. He carried a bundle of dry ironwood, the best wood for a fire, burning hot and long. He placed it next to her. He did not say, "You are welcome." He did not say, "I care," but in the Apache way, The providing of wood was a promise. It meant, I will keep you warm. I will sustain your fire. Mara looked at the wood, then at him. Thank you. Taza. He nodded, settling back against his saddle. The paper, he said suddenly. The code. Yes. It spoke of a safe, a metal box. Yes, but the station safe was empty. Holt blew it open. The white man in the store, Taza said. He spoke of the telegraph office in Silver City. He said the new safe had arrived there. Big iron, hard to break. Mara's mind raced. The code, route change. They moved the ledger. She realized. They didn't leave it at the station. They moved it to the main office in Silver City. That is why they were at the station, to intercept the order to move it, or to ensure it had gone. She looked at Taza. It is in Silver City, in the telegraph office. That is where the proof is. Silver City is a fortress, Taza said. Bluecoats, deputies, and Silas Crow will be watching. We have to get it, Mara said. It is the only way to stop them, the only way to clear my name, and to help your people. If we prove the supplies were stolen by Holt, the army might stop the raids. Taza looked at the fire. He touched the blue bead at his throat. He looked at the white woman who had been cast out by her own kind, just as he had been cast out by the New World. Then we go to Silver City, Taza said. We walk into the belly of the beast. He threw a piece of ironwood onto the fire. Sparks flew up, joining the stars. The plan was set. The safety of the wilderness was behind them. Ahead lay the town, the law, and the guns, and the wind whispered that the storm was far from over. Silver City was a sprawling scar of civilization cut into the side of the mountains, a place of noise, coal smoke, and the relentless hammering of industry. It smelled of unwashed men, manure, and the metallic tang of crushed ore. To Mara, after days in the silent purity of the desert, the town felt like a physical assault. The plan was as precise as a recipe, and just as liable to burn if the heat was too high. Mara stood in the back kitchen of the Silver City Hotel and Dining Hall, her hands deep in a basin of soapy water. The kitchen was a chaotic inferno of shouting cooks, clanging pans, and the heavy scent of roasting beef. She had slipped in through the delivery door an hour ago, wearing a stolen apron and a bonnet pulled low, offering to scrub dishes for a meal. In a town booming with hungry miners, no one asked for references. The telegraph office was next door, sharing a thin wall with the hotel pantry. More water! Girl, move your feet! The head cook bellowed, wiping sweat from his forehead with a greasy rag. Yes, sir, Mara said, her voice rough. She kept her head down. Through the small, grime-streaked window above the sink, she could see the alleyway. It was empty, save for a stray dog and a stack of crates, but she knew Taza was there. He would be motionless, a shadow within a shadow, watching the rear door of the telegraph office. They moved in rhythm, though separated by brick and timber. It was the same rhythm they had found in the cabin, the unspoken coordination of two people who knew that survival depended on anticipating the other person's breath. The clock on the wall chimed 2 of the afternoon. The telegraph operator usually took his meal now. Mara dried her hands on her apron. She grabbed a bucket of slops, the excuse she needed to step outside. She moved to the back door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped into the alley. The air was cooler here, damp, and smelling of refuse. Taza materialized from behind a rain barrel. He did not speak. He pointed a finger toward the roof of the telegraph office. The window was open a crack to let out the heat of the machinery. The guard sits by the front, Taza whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of the street. The operator has gone to the saloon. The safe is in the back room. I need 5 minutes, Mara whispered back. Watch the street. She set the bucket down and climbed onto the crates Taza had silently arranged. He offered his hand a rare physical contact. His grip was hard, his palm calloused. He boosted her up, and she scrambled onto the low roof of the shed that abutted the office. She reached the window and slid it up. She slipped inside, landing silently on the floorboards. The room smelled of ozone and ink. The telegraph key sat silent on the desk, and there, In the corner was the iron safe. It was a formidable black box, painted with gold scrollwork, but Elias had given her the key to a strongbox, not the main safe. She scanned the room. There, on top of a filing cabinet, sat a heavy leather travel satchel, locked with a brass padlock, the kind used to transport ledgers and payrolls. Mara rushed to it. She pulled the key Elias had given her from her bodice. Her hands shook. She inserted the key. It turned. A heavy click echoed in the room. She did not open it there. It was too dangerous. She relocked it, grabbed the heavy satchel, and turned to the window. She was halfway out when the door to the telegraph office opened. "I forgot my tobacco," a voice grumbled. Mara froze, one leg over the sill. The operator walked in. He stopped. He saw the open window. He saw the missing satchel. He saw the hem of a calico dress disappearing onto the roof. "Hey!" he shouted. "Thief, help!" Mara tumbled out onto the shed roof. The satchel clutched to her chest. She slid down the shingles and dropped into the alley, landing hard on her bad leg. Pain shot up her thigh, white and blinding. Taza was already moving. He did not wait for her to recover. He grabbed her arm. Hauling her up. "Run," he said. But the alley was no longer empty. At the far end, blocking their exit to the street, stood a figure in a long duster. Silas Crow. The bounty hunter stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his pale eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked at Mara, then at the Apache, then at the satchel. "Well now," Silas drawled, his voice carrying easily down the narrow passage. "The kitchen girl and her pet wolf. And look at that. She is limping on the right leg, just like the track said." He drew his Colt. The motion was smooth. Practiced. "Back!" Taza shoved Mara behind him. They turned and ran the other way, deeper into the maze of service alleys behind the main street. "Stop them!" Silas yelled, firing a shot into the air. $50 to the man who stops the girl." The shot woke the town. Doors flew open. Men spilled out of saloons, eager for a distraction and a fight. Mara ran, the satchel banging against her hip. Her breath tore at her lungs. Taza was a blur ahead of her, checking corners, leading her away from the shouting mob. They were being herded. Silas was good. He was driving them toward the livery stables and the corral, where the high fences would trap them. They burst out of the alley and into the open dust of the corral. Dozens of horses milled about, spooked by the gunfire. "There!" a voice shouted. Deputies were closing in from the street. Silas was coming from the alley. They were boxed in against the fence. Mara gripped the dull kitchen knife in her belt, though she knew it was useless. "Taza," she gasped. "Go! You can climb the fence! They want me!" Taza looked at her. He looked at the men raising their rifles. He looked at the horses nervous, eyes rolling, smelling the fear in the air. He did not climb. He did not run. He pulled his hunting knife, the big blade with the stag handle. He did not lunge at the deputies. Instead, he turned to the main hitching post that held the rope acting as the gate for the inner pen. With one savage slash, he severed the thick hemp rope. "Hi-yah!" Taza roared, slapping the rump of a massive roan stallion. The stallion reared and charged. The herd, already panicked, followed. A thunder of hooves erupted in the confined space. The horses surged forward like a living flood, pouring out toward the deputies and Silas. Men scattered, diving for cover. Dust choked the air, turning the afternoon into a brown twilight. In the chaos, Taza grabbed Mara. He did not ask if she could run. He swept her up, half carrying her, moving with the flow of the stampede but weaving through the gaps in the fence that the horses had shattered. They rode the wave of confusion out of the town, disappearing into the dust cloud, leaving the shouting and the gunfire behind them. They did not stop until the sun had set and the moon was high and cold. They had lost the horses miles back, turning them loose to confuse the trail, and had climbed on foot into the high, broken country where horses could not follow easily. They found shelter in a fissure in the rock, a deep split in the earth where a geothermal spring bubbled up from the depths. The air here was warm, thick with sulfur and steam. It was a hidden place, a womb of stone protected from the wind. Mara collapsed on the smooth rock floor. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving only the fever. Her leg was burning. The fall from the roof had torn the stitches, and the filth of the alley had done the rest. She shivered violently, her teeth clicking together. Taza knelt beside her. He touched her forehead. His hand was cool. "Dry. You burn," he said. "The satchel," Mara mumbled, clutching the leather bag. "We have the satchel." "The satchel does not matter if you die," Taza said. He moved to the spring. He tore a strip from his own clean shirt and dipped it into the hot water. He returned to her. "I must clean the wound," he said. "The poison is deep." He reached for the hem of her skirt. Mara flinched. A violent shudder went through her, and she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rock wall. Her eyes were wide, glazed with fever and terror. "No," she gasped. Don't touch me." Taza froze. He held his hands up, palms open. The wet cloth dripped onto the stone. "Mara," he said softly. "It is Taza. Look at me. It is Taza." Mara blinked, the present moment warring with a memory. She saw the dark eyes, the scar, the red headband, but she also saw the heavy hand of the station master, the man who had cornered her in the pantry 2 years ago, smelling of whiskey and entitlement. I can't," she whispered. Tears leaked from her eyes. The pain in her leg was a throbbing red line, but the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Taza sat back on his heels. He did not force her. He did not mock her. He waited, letting the steam of the spring wrap around them. "The wound will kill you," he said. "The red lines are climbing your leg. If they reach your heart, the story ends." Mara looked at her leg. It was swollen, angry. She knew he was right. She looked at Taza. He was not looking at her body with hunger. He was looking at her wound with the calculation of a healer, and at her face with the concern of a comrade. She took a shaking breath. She closed her eyes. "Be gentle, please," she whispered, the words barely audible over the bubbling water. Taza moved closer. He did not rush. He carefully lifted the hem of her dress, exposing the inflamed gash. He dipped the cloth again, wringing it out. "Gentle," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small space. "Until you tell me otherwise." He began to clean the wound. It hurt. Mara bit her lip until it bled, but she did not pull away. Taza worked with a surprising delicacy. His large hands, capable of breaking a horse or killing a man, moved with the precision of a surgeon. He washed away the dried blood, the alley muck. He took a pouch from his belt and sprinkled a yellow powder ground root onto the raw flesh. "It stings," he warned. Mara hissed, gripping his shoulder unconsciously. He did not flinch. He became a stone for her to hold on to. The intimacy of the moment was profound. It was not the intimacy of lovers, but the raw, stripped-down connection of two living things keeping death at bay. In the steam and the shadows, with his hand on her calf and her hand on his shoulder, the barriers of race and history dissolved. There was only the wound and the hand that healed it. When he was done, he bound the leg with clean strips of linen. He pulled her skirt down, covering her. He moved back to the other side of the small fire he had built, putting distance between them. He understood that the trust she had just given him was fragile, made of glass. Mara lay back, exhausted, but the panic subsiding. The fever seemed to have broken slightly with the cleaning. She started, her voice raspy. "I am sorry I pulled away." Taza poked the fire with a stick. "You have ghosts." "The station master?" Mara said, staring at the cave ceiling. "Before Holt, a man named Grady, he told me that a woman alone on the frontier needed protection, and that protection had a price." She swallowed the bile in her throat. "He said if I wanted a door with a lock, I had to let him have the key." "I slept in the barn for a year with a pitchfork against the door. I learned to be invisible. I learned that when a man reaches for you, he takes." Taza listened. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not say, "It is okay." It was not okay. The white man takes land he does not work, Taza said, his voice hard. He takes water he does not drink, and he takes women he does not love. It is a sickness of the spirit. It is the hunger that is never full. He looked at her across the fire. I am not a white man, Mara. I take nothing that is not given. Mara looked at him. In the flickering light, he looked ancient and new all at once. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. Not because there was a lock on the door, but because the man sitting guard respected the door itself. Thank you, she whispered. She fell into a restless sleep, the first sleep she had had in days where she did not dream of running. Morning brought a cold, gray light to the fissure. Mara woke to the smell of coffee. Taza had boiled water and used the last of their grounds. She sat up. Her leg was stiff, but the angry heat was gone. Taza was sitting by the entrance, the leather satchel on his knees. He had not opened it. He had waited for her. The prize, he said, handing it to her. Mara took the bag. It was heavy, expensive leather. This was it, the proof, the names, the numbers that would clear her name and stop the raids. She took the small key from her pocket. She unlocked the padlock. She threw the flap open. Her breath hitched. The satchel was filled with old newspapers, tightly packed bundles of the Arizona Miner and the Tombstone Epitaph, cut to the size of ledgers to give the bag weight. No, Mara whispered. She began tearing the papers out, throwing them on the ground. No, no, no. Empty, Taza asked, his voice flat. It is a decoy, Mara cried. They knew someone might come for it. She turned the bag upside down and shook it violently. Something fluttered out, a single, torn page. It drifted down and landed on the stone floor. Mara snatched it up. It was a page from a ledger, the edge jagged where it had been ripped from a binding. It was not the full account, but it was a summary page. May 1880. Supply authorization. There were 2 signatures at the bottom. One was Deputy Holt Rudd. The other was scrawled in a heavy, arrogant hand, Colonel Marcus Graves, 4th Cavalry, and written in the margin, in the same hand, transfer complete. Burn the rest. Mara stared at the paper. They burned it, she said, her voice hollow. The ledger is gone. This is all that is left. Is it enough? Taza asked. Mara read the names again. A deputy and a colonel. 2 powerful men. Against a kitchen girl and an Apache. She looked up at Taza. If we show this to the judge, he might believe us. Or he might burn it too. But it is a name, Taza said. Graves, the leader of the pony soldiers at the fort. Yes. Then we know where the snake's head is, Taza said. He stood up, checking his rifle. We cannot go to the judge with a scrap of paper. We need a witness, or we need to make the snake bite its own tail. Mara folded the paper carefully and put it in her oilcloth pouch, next to her mother's recipes. The despair of the empty bag faded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The supply train, Mara said. The paper mentions a final shipment authorized by Graves. If we can stop that train, if we can show that the wagons are empty before they reach the fort, then the paper proves the lie. Taza nodded. Then we do not run anymore. We hunt. Gentle until told otherwise, Mara whispered to herself, looking at the bandage on her leg. No, Taza said, hearing her. He looked out at the harsh, bright desert. Now, we must be rough. He extended a hand to help her up. This time, Mara took it without flinching. She squeezed his hand. A silent pact sealed in the steam and the dust. They walked out of the fissure, leaving the sanctuary behind, stepping into the light to face the war. Echo Canyon was not a place for mercy. It was a throat of red rock where the wind screamed and the shadows stretched long and sharp like knives. The sun was at its zenith, baking the stone until the air shimmered with a heat that distorted distance and reality. Mara crouched behind a boulder of fallen sandstone, her knees pressed into the gritty earth. Her hands were trembling, but she forced them to be still. In her lap lay her weapons. They were not Colt revolvers or Winchester rifles. They were a pouch of fine gray wood ash mixed with crushed dried chilies, the hottest peppers she could find at the trading post, and her father's dull kitchen knife. They are coming, Taza said. He was beside her, but he felt miles away. He had painted his face with a stripe of black mud across the eyes, the mark of war, or perhaps mourning. He held his rifle with a loose, deadly competence. "Are you sure this is the only way?" Mara whispered. "If we attack them, do we not prove Holt right? Do we not become the savages he says we are?" Taza looked at her. His eyes were hard, but there was a flicker of something softer in them when he looked at her dusty, determined face. "We do not attack to kill," he said, his voice low and steady. "We attack to strip the lie naked. We need the wagon. We need the emptiness inside it. That is the only truth that matters." He paused, looking down the canyon where the dust cloud of the approaching convoy was rising. "But you stay low. If the shooting starts, you run to the high rocks." "I am not running anymore," Mara said, tightening the strings of her apron, the only armor she had. "I am tired of running. Taza, I want to go home. Even if I have to build it out of ashes." Taza nodded once. It was a salute. The convoy appeared around the bend. It was an impressive show of force. 3 heavy freight wagons, covered in canvas, lumbered over the rocky trail. Flanking them were 12 riders. Half were blue-coated cavalry soldiers, young men with sunburned noses who looked nervous. The other half were Holt's men, hard-eyed deputies and hired guns. Leading them was Deputy Holt Rudd. He rode a tall black gelding, his chest puffed out. He had tied a captured Apache lance to his saddle, and he wore a necklace of bear claws that looked ridiculous on his city suit. He was dressed for a play, acting the part of the hero riding into dangerous territory. "Steady," Taza whispered. He did not aim at the men. He aimed at the canyon wall above the trail. When the lead wagon reached the narrowest point, Taza squeezed the trigger. Crack. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. The bullet struck a precarious pile of shale Taza had identified earlier. The rock face gave way. A cascade of stones and dust roared down, not onto the men, but directly in front of the lead horses. The horses panicked. They reared, screaming, tangling their traces. The lead wagon jackknifed, blocking the trail. "Ambush!" Holt screamed, his voice cracking with theatrical glee. "Apache, I told you they are attacking the payroll!" Gunfire erupted. The soldiers began firing blindly at the rim of the canyon, their bullets chipping uselessly against the stone. "Now," Taza said. He moved. He did not charge. He slipped through the rocks like smoke, firing methodical shots that kicked up dust at the horses' feet, adding to the confusion without hitting flesh. His goal was chaos. He needed to separate the wagons from the riders. Mara moved too. She scrambled down the scree slope toward the rear of the convoy. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it would crack her ribs. She was just a cook. She was nobody, but she had the truth in her pocket. The dust was blinding. It tasted of copper and fear. Mara reached the last wagon. The driver had jumped off and was hiding behind a wheel. She ignored him. She slashed at the canvas ties with her knife. "Hey!" a voice boomed behind her. Mara spun around. Silas Crow emerged from the dust cloud. The bounty hunter did not look panicked. He looked bored. He held a long-barreled pistol in one hand, and he moved with a terrifying, languid grace. "The kitchen girl," Silas drawled. "I wondered when you would show up. You have caused me a lot of riding, girl." Mara backed up, her hand clutching the pouch of ash and chili. "Let me go. Silas, the wagons are empty. Look, there are no supplies." "I don't care what is in the wagons," Silas said, stepping closer. "I care about the $500 on your head and the $500 on the buck." He lunged. Mara threw the pouch, but Silas was fast. He ducked, taking the cloud of dust on his duster, and grabbed her wrist. He twisted it, hard. Mara cried out, dropping the knife. Silas spun her around, slamming her back against the wagon wheel. He pressed the cold steel of his knife against her throat. "Taza!" Silas roared over the gunfire. "I have the girl drop the rifle, or I open her up like a sack of flour." The firing from the rock stopped instantly. Silence descended on the canyon, heavy and suffocating. The dust settled slowly. Taza stood up from behind a boulder, 40 yards away. He looked at Mara. He saw the terror in her eyes, the blade pressing into her skin. He saw the end of his world. "Drop it," Silas commanded. Taza slowly lowered the Winchester. He dropped it to the ground. He raised his hands. Holt Rudd rode through the confusion, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. "Well, well," he said, holstering his gun. "The great warrior surrenders for a woman. How pathetic." Holt turned to the soldiers who were peering out from cover. "You see, they attacked us. They tried to steal the payroll. Cut him down." "No!" Mara screamed. The blade bit into her skin, drawing a thin line of blood. "Wait!" a voice called out. A man in a black coat climbed down from the middle wagon. It was Father Jerome, the army chaplain who traveled with the convoy to bless the fort. He was a stern man with a face like dried leather. "He has surrendered, Deputy," the priest said. "We do not shoot unarmed prisoners. He is an Apache dog," Holt spat. "He doesn't get a trial. He gets the law," Father Jerome said firmly. Silas tightened his grip on Mara. "I don't care about the law. I am taking the girl. You can have the buck." Mara felt Silas's breath on her ear. She smelled tobacco and stale sweat. She felt the vibration of his chest as he chuckled. He was confident. He held all the cards. But he had made one mistake. He was holding a cook. And a cook knows that the most dangerous place in the house is the kitchen. Mara remembered the pouch. She had thrown one, but she had kept a handful of the powder in her apron pocket. Her right hand was pinned, but her left hand was free. Silas was focused on Taza. Mara reached into her pocket. She grabbed a fistful of the ash and chili powder. She did not struggle. She went limp for a fraction of a second, making Silas adjust his grip. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Shut up," Silas hissed. In that second of adjustment, Mara moved. She didn't pull away. She turned into him. She jammed her fist upward, smashing her hand into his face, opening her fingers right into his eyes and nose. "Eat this," she screamed. The dried chili and alkaline ash hit Silas's eyes and inhaled breath like liquid fire. Silas howled. It was a sound of pure, shocked agony. He released her, his hands clawing at his burning eyes, coughing violently as the powder coated his throat. Mara dropped to the ground, scrambling for her knife. She grabbed it. She didn't stab him. She didn't have the stomach for murder. She kicked his knee, hard, hearing a satisfying crunch, and rolled away. "Taza!" she yelled. "The wagon!" Taza did not hesitate. As soon as Silas released her, he bolted, not toward the rocks, but toward the lead wagon. Holt saw him. "Kill him!" Holt shouted, raising his revolver. Taza reached the wagon. He grabbed the canvas cover and ripped it violently. The fabric tore with a loud "ree-yip." "Look!" Taza roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The canvas fell away. The wagon bed was empty. No crates of beef, no sacks of flour, no medicine, just bare, weathered wood and a few rocks for ballast. The soldiers stared. Father Jerome stared. "It is empty?" the priest whispered. "It is a lie," Taza shouted, pointing at Holt. "There is no payroll. There are no supplies. He stole them before they left the city." Holt's face went purple. The charade was over. The stage had collapsed. He raised his gun, leveling it not at Taza but at Mara, who was standing exposed near the wheel. "You witch!" Holt screamed. Taza saw the aim. He launched himself away from the wagon, diving across the open space to push Mara down. Bang! The shot hit Taza in midair. He jerked violently, his body twisting, and slammed into the dirt. "Taza!" Mara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She scrambled to him. He was lying on his back, clutching his chest. Blood, bright and dark, was already pulsing between his fingers, staining the dust. Holt cocked the hammer for a second shot. He was smiling. It was the smile of a man who knows he is ruined and wants only to take everyone with him. Mara looked at Taza's rifle, lying in the dirt 5 feet away. She did not think. She moved on instinct to the instinct of the cornered, the instinct of the survivor. She rolled, grabbed the Winchester, and leveraged it against her shoulder. She aimed at Holt. Holt laughed. "You won't shoot, girl. You are just a—" Mara pulled the lever and squeezed the trigger. She did not aim for his heart. She aimed for the horse. The bullet struck the black gelding in the shoulder. The horse screamed and reared, twisting in the air. Holt was thrown. He hit the ground hard, his revolver flying from his hand. He scrambled to get up, reaching for his backup piece. "Stop!" Mara yelled, jacking another shell into the chamber. She aimed the rifle directly at his head. Her hands were steady now. The trembling was gone. "Don't move," she said. Her voice was cold iron. "Or I will put a hole in you where the soul should be." Holt froze. He looked at the soldiers. "Shoot her, she is crazy." But the soldiers did not shoot. They were looking at the empty wagon. They were looking at the priest. Father Jerome stepped forward, his face pale but stern. He walked to the wagon Taza had exposed. He ran his hand over the bare wood. "It is empty," the priest announced, his voice carrying to every man in the canyon. "There are no supplies." "He sold them," Mara said, not taking her eyes off Holt. "He and the contractor. They sold the supplies and blamed the Apache for stealing them. They started a war to hide a theft." She reached into her pocket with one hand, keeping the rifle steady with the other. She pulled out the torn ledger page, the one with the signatures. "Here," she shouted. "Here's the proof signed by Holt Rudd and Colonel Graves." She threw the paper onto the ground near the priest. "Read it." Father Jerome picked up the paper. He adjusted his spectacles. He read the names. He looked at Holt. The look was not one of anger, but of profound disgust. "Corporal," the priest said to the lead soldier, "arrest Deputy Rudd." "You can't do this," Holt spluttered as two soldiers grabbed his arms. "I am the law." "Not anymore," the corporal said. "You are a thief." Mara lowered the rifle. The strength drained out of her legs. She dropped the gun and fell to her knees beside Taza. He was breathing in shallow, wet rasps. His eyes were open, looking up at the slice of blue sky between the canyon walls. "Taza," she whispered, pressing her hands over his wound to staunch the flow. "Stay with me. Please, you promised. Gentle. Remember." Taza looked at her. His lips were stained with blood, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "The wagon," he wheezed. "Empty." "Yes," Mara sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "Everyone saw. The lie is dead." "Good," Taza whispered. "Then the wind can rest." His eyes fluttered shut. "No," Mara shook him. "Doctor, we need a doctor." Father Jerome knelt beside her. He looked at the wound. He looked at Mara's desperate face. "We must get him to the fort," the priest said. "It is an hour ride. If he is strong, he might live." "He is strong," Mara said fiercely. She wiped the blood from her hands onto her apron, staining the white fabric red. "He is the strongest man I know. Help me lift him." She grabbed Taza's shoulders. She was small, and he was heavy. But she pulled with a strength that came from a place deeper than muscle. "We are going home. Taza," she whispered into his ear as the soldiers came to help. "Do you hear me? We are going home." The canyon was silent now, save for the wind. The empty wagon stood as a monument to the truth. And on the ground, the blood of an Apache and the tears of a kitchen girl mixed together in the dust, binding them to the earth and to each other. Forever. The dust from the canyon ambush had settled, but the dust in the air of the territory refused to clear so easily. It had been 3 weeks since the confrontation at Echo Canyon. 3 weeks since the lie had been cracked open like a dry bone for all to see. Mara stood on the porch of the cabin. It was no longer the cold house she had first entered. The roof had been patched with fresh sod. The door had been rehung on leather hinges that did not squeak. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying the scent of piñon wood and roasting venison. It smelled like a home, though Mara still hesitated to call it that aloud. She wiped her hands on her apron, a new one, sewn from a flour sack, and looked down the trail. The news from the fort had come in fragments, carried by the wind and the occasional passing rider. Deputy Holt Rudd was in chains. Sitting in the guardhouse at Fort Bayard, Colonel Graves had been relieved of command and summoned to Washington to answer questions that no amount of gold could silence. But justice in the territory was not a straight line. It was a crooked river that often doubled back on itself. There were whispers that Holt had friends in the territorial legislature. There were rumors that the charges might be reduced from treason to simple mismanagement. The ledger page Mara had provided was damning, but paper was fragile, and men with power had a way of turning ink into water. And then there was the town. Mara had gone into Silver City only once since the shooting, to buy medicine for Taza. The reaction had been a confusing storm. Some, mostly the miners and the working women, had nodded to her with a new respect, calling her the girl who stopped the war. But others, the shopkeepers, the friends of Holt, the people who believed that civilization meant white faces and high fences, had spat on the boardwalk when she passed. To them, she was not a hero. She was a race traitor who had sided with a savage against a badge. She rubbed her arm, remembering the cold stares. She was free, yet she was an outcast. "The soup boils." The voice came from inside. It was low, rough, but stronger than it had been a week ago. Mara turned and went inside. Taza sat by the fire. He was propped up against a pile of blankets, his chest bound in clean linen. He was carving a piece of ironwood with his knife, the shavings curling onto the floor like ribbons of gold. "I am coming," she said, moving to the hearth. She stirred the pot. It was a rich broth made from a deer Taza had instructed her how to skin, thickened with cornmeal. She ladled a bowl and brought it to him. "You should be resting," she scolded gently. "Not whittling." Taza took the bowl. His hand was steady. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his shoulder, missing the bone and the lung. It was a lucky shot, or perhaps the spirits had simply decided it was not his time to die. "My hands need work," Taza said. "If they are still, the mind travels to dark places." He ate in silence. It was a companionable silence now, not the guarded, wary quiet of their first days. Mara watched him. She saw the way the firelight played on the sharp angles of his face, the way his dark eyes tracked her movement around the room. She sat on a stool nearby, picking up her mending. "Father Jerome sent a message," Mara said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "It came this morning with the prospector." Taza paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. "The black robe. What does he say?" "He says the judge is coming from Santa Fe next month. I will have to testify." "You will tell the truth," Taza stated. "I will," Mara said. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "He also brought this." She held up a second envelope. It was made of thick, creamy paper, smelling faintly of lavender water. "Read it," Taza said. "It is from Mrs. Calloway, the wife of the mayor of Silver City. She owns the Grand Hotel." Mara unfolded the letter. "She offers me a job. Head cook, $30 a month. A room of my own on the second floor. She says my skills are wasted in the wilderness." Taza looked at the letter, then at the dirt floor of the cabin, and finally at Mara. $30 was a fortune. A room on the second floor meant a bed with sheets, a window with glass, and safety. It meant she would be Mara Kincaid, the respected cook, not Mara the squawman's woman living in a canyon. "It is a good offer," Taza said. His voice was neutral, stripped of emotion. "Yes," Mara said softly. "It is." "You should take it." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Mara looked up, stung. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "For me to leave?" Taza set the bowl down. He picked up the piece of ironwood again. "It is not about what I want. It is about the winter. It comes soon. The snow will block the pass. Here, there is cold. There is heat. Here, there is danger. There is law." "The law nearly killed us," Mara snapped. "The law is changing," Taza said. "Because of you. But I am still Apache. I cannot live in the town. I cannot sleep in a room on the second floor. I belong to the wind." He looked at her, his eyes unguarded for a fleeting second. "You do not belong to the wind. Mara, you belong to the hearth. You deserve a hearth that does not require a rifle to defend it." Mara stood up, frustration bubbling in her chest. He was pushing her away. He was doing the noble thing, the practical thing, and she hated him for it. I will decide where I belong, she said firmly. She turned and walked out the door, needing the cool air to flush the heat from her cheeks. She walked to the spring, filling the water bucket. The sun was dipping below the rim of the canyon, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange. She heard a twig snap. It was not the sound of a deer. It was the sound of a boot. Mara froze. She dropped the bucket, her hand going to her belt, but she had left her knife inside, on the table. "Hello, girl." Silas Crow stepped out from behind a stand of scrub oak. He looked like a ghost that had crawled out of a grave. His duster was tattered, covered in the red dust of the high country. His face was a ruin. His eyes were red-rimmed and weeping, the skin around them raw and peeling from the burn of the chili powder. He squinted, his vision clearly damaged, peering at her through a haze of pain and rage. But the revolver in his hand was steady enough. "Silas," Mara whispered. "You blinded me," Silas rasped. His voice was like grinding stones. "I can't see the sun without weeping. I can't track a buffalo in the snow." "You tried to kill us," Mara said, backing away slowly toward the cabin. "I was doing a job." Silas spat. "Just business. But the powder, that was personal." He cocked the hammer. "The warrant is still valid. You know, Holt is in jail. But the paper he signed, it hasn't been rescinded yet. The bureaucracy is slow. Technically, you are still a fugitive. And dead fugitives pay just as well as live ones." "You won't get the money," Mara said, her voice shaking but defiant. "Everyone knows the truth now." "I don't care about the money anymore." Silas smiled, a gruesome stretching of cracked lips. "I just want to hear you scream." He took a step forward. "Drop the gun." The voice came from the cabin porch. Taza stood there. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face pale, but he held his Winchester in his one good hand. Silas laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "The cripple! You can barely stand. Apache, you think you can hit me before I put a ball in the girl?" "I do not need to hit you," Taza said calmly. "I only need to wait." "Wait for what?" Silas sneered. "For the spirits. For the marshal," Taza said. Silas blinked, his watery eyes darting around. "What? You are a tracker." "Silas," Taza said, his voice gaining strength. "But your eyes are burned. You did not see the signs. You did not see the dust on the lower trail." Taza gestured with his chin toward the valley floor, far below. "I sent a signal fire 3 hours ago." Taza lied. It was a bluff, pure and simple. There had been no signal. But Taza knew Silas. He knew the man was paranoid, driven by fear as much as greed. "Father Jerome rides with the United States Marshal. They are coming for Holt's accomplices. They are coming for the man who kidnapped a witness." Silas wavered. He looked down the canyon. He couldn't see clearly that was his weakness now. The paranoia took root. If the Marshal was coming, and he was found shooting the girl who had exposed the corruption— "You are lying," Silas hissed. "Am I?" Taza asked. "Can you take the risk with your eyes?" Silas cursed. He lowered the gun slightly, indecision warring with hate. "Go," Taza said. "Run to Mexico. It is the only place left for a dog that bites its master." Silas looked at Mara, then at Taza. He spat on the ground. "This isn't over. I will find you." He holstered his gun, turned, and scrambled back into the brush, heading for his horse. He chose flight. He chose to run from the ghost of the law that Taza had conjured. Mara let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like a lifetime. She ran to the porch. "Is the Marshal really coming?" she asked. Taza sagged against the doorframe, his strength failing him now that the danger had passed. He shook his head. "No, but a man who cannot see clearly sees monsters in every shadow. I gave him a monster." He looked at the direction Silas had fled. "He will run south. He will cross the border. He has stolen army horses in the past. I saw the brand on his mount at the canyon. The rurales in Mexico hang horse thieves without a trial. He goes to his own judgment. It was a justice colder and more efficient than a bullet. Taza had not killed him. He had simply let Silas's own nature act as the noose. Mara put her arm around Taza's waist, supporting him. "Come inside. You're bleeding again." Later that evening, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Taza was resting on his pallet. Mara sat at the table. The letter from Mrs. Calloway lying open in the pool of lamplight. $30. Safety. Respect. She looked at the walls of the cabin. They were rough logs. The wind whistled through the chinking. It was lonely out here. Then she looked at Taza. He reached under his blanket and pulled out the piece of ironwood he had been carving. He held it out to her. Mara took it. It was not a weapon. It was a handle. A smooth, perfectly shaped handle made of the hardest wood in the desert, polished with deer tallow until it shone like dark glass. She looked at her old kitchen knife, the one with the cracked, taped handle that she had carried since the beginning. "The blade is good steel," Taza murmured. "But the handle was weak. It hurt your hand." He had carved a new handle for her knife. It was a simple object, but in that object, Mara saw everything. She saw the hours he had spent shaping it while in pain. She saw the observation he had noticed her rubbing her blistered palm. She saw the respect for her work. He was not giving her a flower. He was giving her a tool. He was saying, "I see your strength, and I want to help you use it." "It fits my hand," Mara whispered, gripping the wood. It felt warm. It felt right. "You have strong hands," Taza said. "Hands that build. Hands that save." He looked at the letter on the table. "If you go to the town, you will cook for rich men. You will be safe, but—" He paused, struggling with the words in the white man's tongue. "But a bird in a cage is safe. That does not mean it is happy." "And if I stay?" Mara asked. "What is here? Taza, just rocks and wind." "And a fire," Taza said. "And a man who will stand by the door until the sun rises." He looked her in the eye. "I cannot promise you $30. I cannot promise you glass in the windows. I can only promise that I will be gentle. Until you tell me otherwise." The echo of their moment in the thermal cave hung between them. It was a promise of agency. He was telling her that her life was hers to rule. Mara looked at the letter. It was an invitation to return to the world that had rejected her, to beg for a place at the bottom of the table. Then she looked at the knife handle. It was an invitation to build her own table. She picked up the letter. She folded it carefully. "I will write to Mrs. Calloway," Mara said. Taza stiffened slightly. "I will tell her," Mara continued, "that I appreciate the offer, but I have a kitchen of my own to run." She walked over to the fire and tossed the envelope into the embers. It curled, blackened, and burst into flame. "I am not going back to be a servant. Taza," she said, turning to him. "I survived the desert. I stopped a war. I am not a kitchen girl anymore." She held up the knife with its new handle. "I am the woman of this house." Taza let out a long breath. The tension left his shoulders. He did not smile, but the warmth in his eyes was brighter than the fire. "Then the house is lucky," he said. "But," Mara added, crossing her arms, "we need a new roof before winter, and a corral. And if you think I am going to cook rabbit stew every night, you are mistaken. I need a garden." "A garden," Taza repeated, testing the word. "In the rocks. We will carry the earth if we have to," Mara said. "Then we will carry the earth." Taza agreed. He reached out his hand. Mara took it. His grip was firm, anchoring her outside. The wind howled through the canyon. A lonely, wild sound. But inside, the fire snapped, and for the first time in her life, Mara did not feel the urge to run. She was not stuck. She was planted, and like the ironwood handle in her hand, she intended to endure. The winter rains had come and gone, washing the blood from the stones of Echo Canyon and turning the high desert into a fleeting, miraculous carpet of wildflowers. Gold poppies and purple lupine fought for space among the sagebrush, proving that even the hardest earth could yield softness if given enough time and water. 6 months had passed since the trial of Deputy Holt Rudd. The proceedings had been swift, overseen by a federal judge who had no patience for corruption that embarrassed the War Department. Holt was currently breaking rocks in a territorial prison in Yuma, a place where the sun was said to be hotter than the devil's own skillet. The contractor had fled east, his reputation ruined, his ledger of lies exposed by a single torn page and the testimony of a kitchen girl. But justice, Mara Kincaid had learned, did not magically erase the lines drawn in the sand. She stood on the porch of her new home. It was not a grand hotel in the center of Silver City, nor was it the drafty, abandoned cabin in the wilderness. It was a small, sturdy structure built of adobe and timber. Situated on the very edge of the town, to the east lay the smoking chimneys and bustling streets of civilization. To the west, the open, rolling expanse of the Apache lands. She was exactly where she chose to be on the border. A hand-painted sign swung gently in the morning breeze above the door, the hearth meal's bread. It was humble, but the smell drifting from the open windows was rich enough to stop a galloping horse. It smelled of yeast, roasting chilies, and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Mara wiped her hands on her apron. She was thinner than she had been a year ago, but the hollow look of fear was gone from her eyes. In its place was a quiet, steady light. She wore her hair braided back, practical and neat, and at her belt hung the knife with the ironwood handle, the tool of her trade, and the symbol of her survival. "Morning, Miss Mara," a voice called out. A prospector led his mule up the path. He was a regular, an old man with a beard like a bird's nest, who paid in gold dust and polite nods. "Morning, Mr. Jebb," Mara replied. "The biscuits are hot, and there is stew from last night. Smells like heaven," the old man said, tying his mule to the hitching rail. He was not the only one. 2 freight drivers were already inside, eating silently at the long communal table. A few minutes later, a young woman from the town, a laundress who had once crossed the street to avoid Mara, hurried in to buy a loaf of bread, exchanging a shy, quick smile before rushing away. The town did not embrace Mara. The polite society of Silver City, the wives of the merchants and the new officers at the fort, still whispered. They called her the Indian lover behind their fans. They said she was wild, tainted, but they could not deny that her bread was the best in the territory. And in the West, quality often outlasted prejudice. Mara took the coin from the laundress and dropped it into the jar on the counter. She did not need their love. She needed their respect, or at least their commerce. She had built this place with the reward money, the reward that Silas Crow had forfeited when he ran. She had taken the price on her own head and turned it into a roof. The sound of hoofbeats approached from the west. It was a rhythm Mara knew by heart. It was not the heavy clop of a plow horse or the erratic gallop of a cowboy's pony. It was a steady, ground-eating lope. She walked to the door. Taza rode a paint horse, a sturdy animal with intelligent eyes. He wore the clothes of a scout, now a mix of Apache buckskin and Army-issue wool. A red headband still held back his dark hair, but on his vest he wore a small brass badge. It did not say sheriff. It said scout. He pulled the horse up and dismounted in one fluid motion. His shoulder had healed, leaving a puckered scar that he touched only when the rain was coming. He did not rush to her. He tied the horse next to the mule, checking the animal's hooves before turning to walk up the steps. This was their dance, public yet private. "The road was long?" Mara asked. "The road is always long," Taza replied. His English had improved, though he still spoke with the economy of a man who knows that words can be wasted. But silence cannot. He walked past her into the kitchen, removing his hat. The freight drivers looked up, tensed for a moment, then went back to their stew. 6 months ago, an Apache walking into a dining room would have caused a riot. Now, it caused a pause. It was not equality, but it was a start. Taza went to the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the wall, watching her work. "Colonel Miller is pleased," Taza said softly, so only she could hear. "We found the new spring in the Dragon Mountains. I marked it on the map. He agreed it belongs to the people. The cattlemen will not fence it." "That is good," Mara said, kneading a fresh ball of dough. "He keeps his word. This new colonel. He keeps his word because he knows I watch him, Taza corrected. And because he saw the ledger, he knows that lies cost more than truth in the end. Taza was not living in the house. He spent weeks on the trail, working as a bridge between the fort and the reservation. He translated, he mapped, he mediated. It was a dangerous path. The young warriors called him a blue-coat dog. The soldiers called him a savage. But Taza walked the line because he knew that war would wipe his people from the earth. He fought with maps and words now, saving lives by securing water rights and boundaries. But he always came back here. "Are you hungry?" Mara asked. "I could eat," he said. She fixed him a plate. He sat at the small table in the corner, the one reserved for him. Mara continued to work, serving the customers, cleaning the counter. They did not touch. They did not speak of love in front of the strangers. But the connection between them was a tangible thing, a tether that pulled taut across the room. By noon, the rush had ended. The old prospector had wandered off toward the hills, and the drivers had returned to their wagons. The kitchen was quiet, filled only with the ticking of the clock and the settling of the fire. Mara locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat opposite Taza. "You look tired," she said, reaching out to brush dust from his sleeve. "The wind does not sleep," Taza said. He looked at her, his dark eyes softening. "But the fire is good." He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of soft doe skin. He placed it on the table between them. "I passed through the trading post at San Carlos," he said. "There was a silversmith there, a man of the Navajo, who travels." Mara looked at the bundle. She looked at him. "Open it," he said. She unfolded the leather. Inside lay a bracelet. It was not a delicate, frilly thing like the ladies in town wore. It was a band of hammered silver, substantial and heavy. Etched into the metal was a pattern, a jagged line of mountains, and below them, a winding line of water. "The mountains and the river," Taza explained. "The rock that endures, and the water that gives life." He hesitated, then added, "It is also the scar of the canyon, where we stopped the lie." Mara ran her thumb over the cool metal. It was beautiful in its simplicity. It was real. "It is beautiful. Taza," she whispered, "I do not have a ring of gold." Taza said, "And I cannot give you a name that the white priest will bless. I am Taza. I belong to the wind and the high places. If I stay in this house every night, I will die inside. If you come to the mountains with me, you will wither." He leaned forward. "We are different, Mara, like the hawk and the badger. One hunts the sky. One builds the home." "I know," Mara said. She had accepted this. She did not want him to be a farmer. She loved the wildness in him, just as he loved the anchor in her. "But," Taza continued, picking up the bracelet and taking her wrist, "the hawk needs a place to land, and the badger needs to see the sky." He slipped the silver band onto her wrist. It fit perfectly. The cool metal warmed instantly against her skin. "This is my promise," Taza said, his voice low and fierce. "I do not own you. You do not own me. We are not property to be traded or fenced. But this place," he gestured to the room, to the fire, to the knife hanging on the wall. "This place is ours. When I ride out, I carry this place with me. When you sleep here, you are not alone." Mara looked at the bracelet, then up at his face. She saw the love there, stripped of all the flowery poetry of the romance novels she used to read. This was a love made of ironwood and silver, forged in survival. "I do not want to be owned," Mara said. "I was owned once, by fear. I will never go back to that." She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his rough, scarred ones. "But I want to be known," she said. "And you know me, Taza. You saw me when I was invisible." "I see you," Taza said. "I see the woman who holds the knife. I see the woman who makes the bread." He stood up and pulled her to her feet. He did not kiss her like a boy stealing a favor. He held her face in his hands and pressed his forehead against hers. It was an Apache greeting, a sharing of breath, a mingling of spirits. "Welcome home, Taza," she whispered. "It is good to be home," he murmured. They stood there for a long time, the silence of the house wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Outside, the world was still hard. There were still men who hated them. There were still droughts and storms and the uncertainty of a territory that was changing too fast. But in here, the air was still later, as the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the floor. They went out to the porch. Mara leaned against the railing, watching the colors bleed across the sky. Taza stood beside her, whittling a new latch for the gate. Above the door, nailed to the lintel, were two objects. One was an old iron horseshoe, a symbol of luck in the settler's way. The other was a bundle of dried sage and a single hawk feather, tied with red sinew, a blessing of protection from the mountain spirits. They hung side by side, different, but occupying the same space, down the road. The telegraph wires hummed in the wind. Hum, hum, hum. The singing wire. Once, Mara had feared it. She had feared the messages of doom it carried. Now, she just heard it as the pulse of the world, beating on. She looked at her wrist, where the silver flashed in the twilight. She looked at Taza, who was watching the horizon with that eternal, vigilant stillness. She remembered the terrified girl who had run into the storm with a dull knife. She remembered the pain in the thermal cave, and the whisper, "Be gentle." Taza had been gentle, but he had also been strong enough to let her find her own strength. "The winter will be cold," Taza said, looking at the clouds gathering over the Mogollon rim. "Let it come," Mara said, crossing her arms and feeling the solid weight of the silver. "The wood is stacked, the cellar is full, and the knife is sharp." Taza looked at her and smiled a rare, full smile that showed the man beneath the warrior. "Yes," he said, "the knife is sharp." He put his arm around her shoulders. It was a heavy, warm weight. Mara leaned into him, not for support, but for connection. They stood together on the edge of the town, on the edge of the wild, watching the night roll in. They did not know what the next year would bring. The railroads were coming. The old ways were fading, but they knew one thing with absolute certainty. They did not have to run anymore. They had stopped. They had planted a seed in the hard earth, and against all odds, it had bloomed. The wind blew past them, carrying the scent of rain and sage, but it did not push them. They were rooted. They were home. Thank you so much for listening to this story of the American West. It has been a journey through the dust, the danger, and the quiet moments of connection that make life worth living, even in the harshest of times. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in a busy city, or somewhere quiet like Mara's cabin? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. Did Taza and Mara make the right choice? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button and press the hype button to help this story reach more people who love the spirit of the frontier. Your support keeps the campfire burning and the stories coming. Thank you. And until the next ride,